Good afternoon, everyone. The Leuven Center of Global Governance Studies, and as of 2020, the official European Union Jean Monnet Center of Excellence for Space Governance, is very pleased to virtually host today Dr. Carine Claeys as a distinguished guest for this webinar series. Her professional experience shows the breadth of positions that she has taken up. In fact, Dr. Claeys is the EU Special Envoy for Space in the European External Action Service since 2019, and as of March 2020, she's also the head of division SecDevPol 5. Previously, she was head of the EEAS Space Task Force, now a division since 2015, and she also headed the security of the EU space suits of the EU Joint Situation Center from 2005 to 2011. She has been a multilateral diplomat in the General Secretariat of the Council and in the EEAS since 1992, where she dealt with a broad range of issues such as energy, drugs, terrorism, United Nations, public international law, agriculture, enlargement, transport, and so on. Carine Claeys is also an academic. She holds a PhD in political science, a master's degree in business engineering, a master's degree in international relations, and a master's degree in development cooperation. And she has been our distinguished lecturer now since already 3 years, where students have really shown appreciation of her insights. At the 13th European Space Conference, the High Representative Josep Borrell emphasized the fact that our European space sector is an enabler of European strategic autonomy, where without strategic autonomy in space, there can be no strategic autonomy on Earth. And it is in this regard that today's webinar will show us why strategic autonomy is a critical element of the European space ecosystem and how this can be successfully achieved and implemented. The lecture will be around 1 hour and a half. Please feel free to ask your questions already during the lecture in order to be able to select them and then ask them to our speaker. And unfortunately, we will have to ask Dr. Claeys virtually because there are some issues with the platform, but nevertheless, the lecture will still be, I'm sure, very exciting. Dr. Claeys, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julia. One clarification, maybe I'm not sure that the lecture will be as long as 1 hour and a half, because also I would very much like to have a interesting Q&A session. So if I take the floor for less time, there is more time for Q&A, and I would welcome questions and interaction with the audience. We chose indeed a subject to be treated today being strategic autonomy, and strategic autonomy as a critical element of the European space ecosystem. As you rightly mentioned, Julia, at the European Space Conference this year, the High Representative Vice President Josep Borrell focused his remark on how space is a crucial component of wider work on developing Europe's strategic autonomy. The topic I suggested for the lecture today is therefore around this precise topic. It is not by chance, of course. First, because the High Representative Vice President is my boss. We share the same concerns and have the same objectives. Second, because the pandemic and the sanitary crisis have taught us one thing, at least as Europeans. It is that we need to enhance our strategic autonomy in different domains. And one of these domains is space. So let me tell you why and where does this lead us. First, what is European strategic autonomy? Let me quote the HRVP again. He says, "Some see in strategic autonomy an illusion that is best abandoned, especially after Joe Biden's victory. Others see it a political imperative to be pursued more than ever. In between, yet others suggest that we need to avoid all theological disputes and give practical content to these words. As HRVP Borrell, I put myself more in the last category. Strategic autonomy is about protecting our capacity to act according to our interests and reducing our over-dependencies and our vulnerabilities. The EU is facing serious strategic challenges in today's antagonistic international environment, where geopolitical rivalries and great power competition are on the rise. That is why, as German Chancellor Angela Merkel once bluntly put it, we Europeans truly have to take our fate into our own hands. We must stand on our own feet. For a very long time, the debate about strategic autonomy focused mainly on security and defense. The relationship with NATO and the positioning of EU member states within NATO were key items of the debate. There is no question, of course, that this is an important debate. But Europe's security challenges go far beyond NATO's traditional remit. The Council of the EU in November 2016 already defined the EU's strategic autonomy in the framework of the global strategy. And it defines it as its capacity to act autonomously when and where necessary, and with partners wherever possible. In order to be a credible actor of regional stability, Europe must develop its own framework for monitoring and analyzing threats, so that it can move quickly from threat assessment to operationalization and response. These issues are developed in the present strategic compass exercise. This strategic compass exercise is also particularly important for harmonizing the perceptions of threats and risks. And precisely harmonizing the perceptions of threats and risks is the condition for building together the reaction to these threats and risks, part of which is the peculiar concept of strategic autonomy. It is also crucial for the strategic autonomy discussion to expand far beyond the issues of defense and security. It applies to a wide range of issues, including trade, finance, investment, and data. Economic interdependence should be looked at, as well as a certain control of the supply chain. The sanitary crisis has revealed the fundamentally asymmetrical nature of interdependence and the vulnerability of Europe. Science, technology, trade, data, investments are becoming sources and instruments of force in international politics. Achieving strategic autonomy also will require intensive leveraging of the power of Europe's single market. With its vast size and scope, the single market offers many instruments for safeguarding European interests with respect to critical infrastructure, foreign investment, state subsidies, from which certain foreign investors benefit, or dual use export, meaning exports with a military or a commercial use. Developing an industrial strategy is less taboo than it was at the beginning of the century, when the two first space flagships of the EU were conceived. PESCO, the EDF, and the financing of joint military projects to enhance the EU's defense and technological industrial base is an important proof thereof, as are ideas like the structuring of an hydrogen industry, the setting up of the Alliance of Batteries, or the Alliance of Raw Materials, and the various initiatives in the health sector as a response to the sanitary crisis. Autonomy should not imply total independence or isolation from the rest of the world, however. Rather, it refers to an ability to think for oneself and to act according to one's own values and interests. The European Union needs to achieve this kind of autonomy, while at the same time strengthening its alliances and preserving its commitments to multilateralism and openness. Former Trade Commissioner Phil Hogan referred to this as open strategic autonomy. The concept has been retained by the Foreign Affairs Council in December 2020. This is not about protectionism, says the FAC. Some people want to call it open strategic autonomy to stress the fact that this is not to go back to any kind of autarky or protectionism. It is not directed against anyone. It is about choosing our interdependence instead of having it imposed on us, be it with masks when the pandemic arrived, be it with technologies now and in the future. We must be able to act multilaterally when we can. This is our preference. But also to be able to act autonomously when we must, in order to promote and defend more effectively our interests and values. So as we see, strategic autonomy is neither autarky nor protectionism. It is, however, true that it took approximately 2 years for member states to reach a common agreement on the participation of third states in the PESCO projects. This despite the fact that there are obvious reasons for which such participation is beneficial, such as the close complementarity between NATO allies in terms of resources and capabilities. The Council explains it as follows, and I quote the Council conclusions on a recovery advancing the transition towards a more dynamic, resilient and competitive European industry of November last. The Council highlights that achieving strategic autonomy while preserving an open economy is a key objective of the Union in order to self-determine its economic path and interests. The Council recalls that this includes identifying and reducing strategic dependencies and increasing resilience in the most sensitive industrial ecosystems and specific areas, such as health, defense industry, space, digital, energy, and critical raw materials. The Council underlines that this can include diversifying production and supply chains ensuring strategic stockpiling, fostering and attracting investments and productions in Europe, exploring alternative solutions and circular models, and promoting broad industrial cooperation across member states. So now that we have a better understanding of what strategic autonomy means, what is the link with the space ecosystem? You've heard that space was specifically referred to in the November 2020 conclusions. In essence, space is an enabler. Our presence in space enables us to achieve our goals in science, economy, and security. In this way, our European space sector is an enabler of European strategic autonomy. As stated by Daniel Fiott from the European Union Institute for Security Study in a study that he wrote for the European Parliament Subcommittee on Security and Defense, and that Julia reminded us about in her introduction, without strategic autonomy in space, there can be no strategic autonomy on Earth. There is a need for the Union to invest in its space presence, push the technological frontier in space, ensure that its ground and space-based critical infrastructure is protected, ensure that its industrial supply chains are resilient, and utilize new initiatives in security and defense to further enhance the EU's ability to act autonomously. Let's analyze the situation a bit more in depth. Our daily life is increasingly dependent on space tools. Most of the time they are invisible, transparent. As the French Minister for the Armed Force, Florence Parly, stated a bit less than 2 years ago, if I well remember, from rural to urban areas, from the very small to the large companies, every day, more than 10 satellites on average accompany us and help us in our daily lives. We speak here about positioning, navigation, and timing signals provided by global positioning systems like the European Galileo or the American GPS, about remote sensing Earth observation data, for which the European Copernicus system is the largest provider in the world, about broadcasting relay and telecommunication. Is it needed to recall the ever-growing digitalization of our economy and our lives? The digital economy, the fourth industrial revolution, agriculture, transport, across the transport modes, land, water, air, fishing, energy, finance, urban development, telecommunication, environmental monitoring, and the broad security chain from civil protection to security and defense are amongst the space-reliant sectors, and therefore sectors that are also vulnerable should space assets be at risk. In parallel, space is increasingly contested, congested, and competitive. Congested as more and more countries and actors are launching an increasing number of civilian and military satellites. There are currently around 5,500 satellites in orbit, of which less than 2,500 are operational. This has created a real problem on how to handle the proliferation of space debris and risks of collisions. This development is now aggravated by the trend of launching larger constellations with shorter lifespans. Space is also increasingly contested. The continuing development of capabilities that are able to interfere directly with space objects or with satellite services in general poses a growing risk of an extension of conflicts into space or the escalation of conflict in and from outer space, where they not only affect potential conflict parties, but the peaceful use of outer space for all users. The destruction of space objects or the interruption of their services pose an inherent risk to connected societies increasingly dependent on these services. And space is also increasingly competitive. Access to outer space, limited to a handful of spacefaring nations, is past history. There are numerous new space actors, be them new spacefaring nations who want a certain level of autonomy and also who assign a high symbolic value to the presence in outer space. Outer space is indeed always a coveted last frontier. And also the so-called new space actors, which I will very broadly define here as private initiatives backed by venture capital instead of by the traditional public space and defense budget, whilst recognizing that the concept is subject to discussion. Space assets are therefore indeed at risk. This means that our economy, our security, and our daily life are vulnerable. Countering threats and building strategic autonomy should therefore be seen as strengthening two pillars on a common foundation, and I will elaborate on that. The first pillar is the capability pillar. It has two legs, a space tool leg and a security from space leg. The space tool leg is the classical industrial policy action. The about to be adopted EU space program regulation is the EU's main instrument on the matter today. The European Global Navigation Satellite System, GNSS, which encompasses Galileo and EGNOS, has been the first EU flagship with a clear objective of strategic autonomy. The second EU flagship, the Copernicus program, is also providing an important leverage for the European industrial and technological base. And there is a third flagship in the making, the Secure Space-Based Connectivity Initiative, launched by Commissioner Breton at the beginning of the year. European investment, however, in the space sector is about 5 to 6 times less important than that of the US. China has also become a very large space investor, with a budget which is not really known, but which is assessed to be around or a bit superior to the European one. Strategic autonomy undoubtedly passes through an increase in public and private investment in the space sector. Action should also be taken to support research and innovation, including up to the industrial phase. The space tool leg also is linked to the use of the space tool. The EU has a tremendous capacity of rule-making. It could use that capacity to encourage or even make compulsory the use of space-based services. The snowball effect would certainly materialize in additional innovative application and possible commercial markets. And this leads me to the second leg of the capability pillar, the security from space leg. It is about protecting the security of the Union and of its citizens on Earth. Coming back to the two EU flagships, I don't need to recall the key capability constituted by the Galileo Public Regulated Service, which gives the positioning, navigation, and timing service enhanced continuity and robustness. The PRS can be used for crucial civil applications, security applications, and if member states so wish, for military applications. It is by essence a dual-use service. On the Copernicus side also, although it might be less known that the majority of the Copernicus services benefiting from an open, full and free access policy, there are also 3 security services which provide key data in the fields of border surveillance, maritime surveillance, and support to external action. With the help of the Copernicus program, as well as with its own data sources, the European Union Satellite Centre, SATCEN, plays an essential role in improving the EU's situational awareness. For instance, it has been instrumental to the success of the European Union's military operation Irene in the Mediterranean. It would really be difficult to imagine any operation such as Irene working efficiently without the support of the situational awareness offered by the satellite capability. I mentioned it already. Space and defense technologies are interlinked. For instance, EU space-based application can provide crucial operational capabilities such as precision navigation, surveillance, communications, and situational awareness. There are cooperation projects regarding space in the PESCO framework. More can still be done. Developing strong space capabilities will remain a central focus for the years to come. This has already been identified in the ongoing work on the strategic compass. The second pillar of the EU's strategic autonomy in space is what I call security of space. It is about protecting the security of the Union in space. And like the first pillar, this pillar also has 2 legs. On the one hand, the EU's ability to react in the case of a threat to the Union's space assets. And on the other hand, the space situational awareness leg. This pillar allows us to continue using space as an enabler for our economy and our other policies. The EU's ability to react in the case of a threat to the Union's space assets has been established in 2004, 1.5 years before the first Galileo test satellite, Jove-A, was launched. The Galileo program, which is a very complex space program, has included from the very beginning a comprehensive risk management cycle and security measures. In this framework, the Council decided a joint action on aspects of the operation of the European Satellite Radio Navigation System affecting the security of the European Union. And this action did put the High Representative in charge of the operational security-related crisis management for Galileo. In 2014, at about the time when the development of the Galileo FOC satellite constellation started, this decision was revised, and in its capacity of serving the High Representative, the EEAS nominated a special envoy for space and set up a team to support the HR in carrying out its space-related operational responsibilities. These responsibilities are indeed about to be extended from the European GNSS only to all the systems and services linked to all the components of the new EU Space Programme regulation as far as they are considered security sensitive. The two legal acts, the EU Space Programme regulation and the Council decision on the security of space systems and services, are expected to be adopted in parallel in about 2 months. Finally, the second leg of the second pillar is the Space Situational Awareness Capability, SSA, which is needed to monitor and, when necessary, to protect the EU space assets in orbit and to preserve the European autonomous access to space. I told you that space was increasingly congested, contested, and competitive. There are threats in outer space, ranging from natural hazards to a large amount of man-made debris or to intentional anti-satellite weapons. SSA capabilities aim at monitoring the space environment. They include space weather and near-Earth object monitoring, aiming at observing natural hazards. They also include space surveillance and tracking capabilities, aiming at monitoring and tracking space objects, in particular spacecraft and space debris. For instance, not later than approximately 1 month ago, a Galileo satellite had to move from orbit in order to avoid a collision with a space debris which was a part of a former Ariane 4 launcher. And they finally can include a space traffic monitoring or coordination or management, depending on the on the level of ambition of the capability. So a space traffic monitoring, coordination, or management, governance, and capability. As you can see, the EU strategic autonomy is being built. We have a building with 2 pillars composed of 2 legs, each of them. And these two pillars are based on a solid foundation, and this is the 3SOS initiative. 3SOS stands for safety, security, and sustainability in outer space, or safety, security, and sustainability of outer space activities. It is an EU public diplomacy campaign promoting responsible behavior in outer space amid concerns about orbital debris and arms race. The EU continuously promotes the preservation of a safe, secure, and sustainable space environment, and the peaceful use of outer space on an equitable and mutually acceptable basis. We stress the importance also of transparency and confidence building measures, and the need to advocate responsible behavior in outer space in the framework of the United Nations, essentially. Multilateral approaches are needed to develop further the current normative framework in order to address new realities. And as you know also, multilateralism is really the DNA of the EU, and therefore we cannot but support approaches in multilateral framework. The 3SOS campaign aims at building support for a safe, secure, and sustainable outer space, promoting a sustainable approach to space by avoiding collisions, reducing the creation of long-lived orbital debris, and promoting transparency and confidence building measures in an effort to reduce the risk of mishaps, misperceptions, and mistrust in the area of space security and stability, which then would reduce the risk of conflict in outer space. A better common understanding of risks and threats to space systems and services is required at worldwide level. This would be the basis for multilateral efforts to reduce and mitigate such risks and threats in order to preserve a safe and secure space environment for all humankind, today and for future generations. The EU is of the opinion that the issue of developing pragmatic and effective voluntary norms for outer space is a real question for today. Such voluntary norms would support responsible behavior in outer space and should be built through greater coordination and cooperation. There is also a need for a timely, global, common, and multilateral solution. This is the second reading of the acronym 3SOS. Thrice SOS. 3 times it is important to act swiftly. Let me conclude my introductory comments as I started them, quoting my boss, the High Representative, Vice President of the Commission, Josep Borrell. He said, when it comes to implementing our EU space strategy, we must harness all our tools, the European Union and member states, public and private, financial and political, in support of our common objectives. This is what it means when we say that space is a strategic issue. Strategic autonomy is not a magic wand, but a process, a long-term one, intended to ensure that Europeans increasingly take charge of themselves, to defend our interests and values in an increasingly harsh world, a world that obliges us to rely on ourselves to guarantee our future. Strategic autonomy is indeed a critical element when it comes to protecting not only our common space assets and our economy, but also the European Union, its member states, their citizens, and our common values. With this, Julia, I would like to end my introductory remarks so as to leave room enough for a fruitful Q&A session. Hello?
That was a very excellent lecture. The first question is how can the private sector be involved in this process, and namely whether, since it is more and more part of the space security landscape, how it will be involved, for instance, in the SO3 SOS initiative. And I think we can start with this one and then elaborate more.
Yeah, I heard the first part of the question, but not the second part of the question. So the first part is how to involve the private sector more.
Yeah. And then whether it will be involved or not in the 3 SOS initiative discussions.
Okay, thank you. So it is indeed absolutely crucial that the private sector is involved. Strategic autonomy is not something that is being declared by public authorities and then happens like a miracle. It is the whole ecosystem that has to act towards a chosen interdependency and not an imposed dependency, if I can say so. For this, of course, public investment is important, but private investment also. And a mastering of the supply chain with appropriate investment in the missing links is also an important element. Regarding more in particular the 3 SOS public diplomacy campaign, this campaign is indeed has as a target the whole community, meaning the decision makers, be them public or private, the industry in itself, be it the manufacturing industry or being the operating industry, but also people like you, academics, think tanks, those who are forming the awareness of decision makers and the global population. It is absolutely crucial that as many people as possible do obtain a common understanding of the vulnerability of our way of life versus the space assets. The fact that in our daily life we depend on the transparent space tools, the fact that approximately 60% of our global economy does directly or indirectly depend from a space tool, that up to 80% of the capability worn by the soldier of today depends directly or indirectly from space tool. Those figures are really enormous, and they are transparent. We don't know that, for instance, when we're going to an ATM machine in order to pick up some money, we cannot do that without a precise timing being given by a space tool. The fact that, of course, things like the development of autonomous car cannot happen without a very, very precise global positioning system, meaning the use of both or even more than two constellations of global positioning, be it GPS, Galileo, or in Asia, Beidou, or GLONASS in Russia. I mean, those are tools that we just don't know that we are using them every day. And this is really crucial that everyone, decision maker, but also the global population and the investor, are conscious of the dependency that we have on space tools, and therefore our vulnerability to them, as well as the possible tools that we could have in order to diminish and to reduce the risk that a threat does meet our vulnerability. So it is up to everyone to play, if I may say so, in this global public diplomacy campaign by relaying the messages, relaying what they have learned about the vulnerabilities and about the threats that do exist, and that could lead to what is called the Kessler Syndrome, of the name of Donald Kessler, who was an astrophysician of NASA in the 70s of last century, who realized that there are already at that time, and particularly now with the increasing congestion of the orbits, there are that many spacecrafts and space debris in particular the low Earth orbit, then any kind of collision could cause a domino effect, with the risk of collision increasing in a dramatic manner, one after the other, with the increase being more important exponentially from one collision to the other because of the congestion of the orbits, and that could lead to the low Earth orbit not being accessible anymore for everyone. And we speak there about strategic autonomy, but not only the strategic autonomy of the European players or the strategic autonomy of other players like the US or the Russians or the Chinese, but the strategic autonomy of the whole Earth environment, who might not be able to use orbits anymore. And one of the characteristics of the low Earth orbit is that in order to launch something further, you have to pass through that orbit because it is the closer to the Earth. So not acting globally and swiftly could lead to the outer space not being accessible anymore for generations. So the matter is really important, and everyone from public authorities to industry to the private sector, but also to academics, think tanks, and influencers, if I can use that word, have a role to play in order to push for a global swift solution, meaning in order to build that fertile soil on which a suitable multilateral and global solution can be built.
Thank you for the extensive answer. The second question is more about, of course, an old similarity with the 3 SOS. And one of the attendees asked whether what is in practice the current action of the European Union in promoting the code of conduct, or what has remained of the code of conduct, and also what will be this time the fora where this initiative will be promoted, if any. And then I have a personal question, which is how this, and this relates more to the 3 SOS, how this initiative is related with the current initiative sponsored initially by the UK government within the United Nations framework for a resolution on responsible behavior in outer space, whether there are some common grounds between the two, whether there have been discussions also on how to coordinate or not at all. Thank you.
Okay. So let me try to answer to the various parts. First, as I told you, the 3 SOS public diplomacy campaign is a campaign, is a public diplomacy campaign, meaning that it aims at raising awareness. This public diplomacy campaign does not aim at suggesting precise, concrete measures, but that, as I said, prepare the soil for future seeding. But it is limited, if I can say so, to preparing the soil, which every gardener knows is an essential part of gardening or of growing vegetables, is to prepare the soil. The various actions that we are doing are essentially linked to the organization of workshops and of awareness raising activities, now you will realize that unfortunately this public diplomacy campaign has been launched at the end of 2019, and then the sanitary crisis came, and we were for quite a while rather blocked into the organization of various workshops and others because of the sanitary crisis. Now we are working on preparing, nevertheless, expert meetings in order to exchange views and do that as far as possible in a virtual form, like you are organizing your lecture series. I think that everyone is now getting more and more used to using the digital tools in order to be able to organize that kind of workshop. The organization of workshop and the possibility to meet experts from various parts of the world is an integral part of the bilateral relations that the European Union is entertaining with quite a lot of countries. When we have a partnership, when possible, we try to include also a space element in it, and not only with spacefaring nations or all spacefaring nations, but also when possible with new space actors, because we know very well, and as I explained, that it is a challenge not only for today, but also for tomorrow and for future generations. So that is one element. Another element is your question about the link with the EU-led initiative of an international code of conduct for outer space activity. Well, as you know, in 2015, the negotiation of the international code of conduct led to a deadlock. Not, I think, because of the content of the text, but much more about the way the project had been put on the table and negotiated. Considering this deadlock, we have tried to draw lessons about that deadlock, that failure. I think we finally need to call the ICOC experience finally a failure, because we have not been able to progress since that famous summer 2015. And the various lessons that we have learned out of this process is that procedurally we have not processed in an adequate way. The European Union and very close partners have agreed on a text, on principles, which are quite a lot of them still very valid, I think. But they have agreed on that to the last comma. And then went to the international community outside of the United Nations framework initially, and did put it on the table almost as a take it or leave it document. The lesson we have learned from that exercise is that this is not the appropriate way to work. That what we should preferably do is to prepare the soil, to try having a common understanding of the vulnerabilities and of the threats, and then offer possible ways forward and encourage an inclusive process to happen within the framework of the United Nations. In this framework, we have welcomed with great interest both the adoption of the preamble and the 21 long-term sustainability guidelines in the framework of COPIOS in 2019, and of course later in the United Nations General Assembly, and as well the launch of the resolution on reducing threats by promoting rules, norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior in outer space, launched initially by the UK, supported by series of countries, not only Western countries, and adopted by the General Assembly in December 2020. These are the diplomatic multilateral diplomacy tools that are used indeed to build something on the soil that we want to prepare. And this soil is the soil of everyone. If we have a common understanding, any kind of state wanting to present measures that would help for reaching the common goal of safety, security, and sustainability of outer space is welcome to propose a way forward with concrete actions. The way the UK has done it with proposing its draft resolution, which became a resolution already last year, is a very good step ahead, and is a step ahead in the right direction, but it's not the last step, of course. First, I think that this resolution will most probably be a recurrent resolution being presented, and as you certainly know, it calls upon member states of the United Nations to present their views on a certain number of things, ranging from their appreciation and their analysis of the threats, as well as what kind of behavior can be deemed responsible, not responsible, or dangerous, and what kind of measure could possibly be taken in order to promote the responsible behavior. So it is the start of a process which has also as a goal to ensure a better and common understanding of what the threats are. So it's going into the right direction, and the EU, of course, does welcome those initiatives. I hope that I have answered all the parts of your questions.
I think so. Another question is, before you mentioned that to reach strategic autonomy, the European Union is also investing in capabilities, not only in its flagship programs, but we have seen also with the new regulation that some budget will also be allocated for SST, in support of SSA. But also the European Defence Fund was said that it would have boost also joint programs relating also to space security on the European Union territory. One question of the audience is, after the declaration by NATO that the outer space is also now a warfighting domain, to which extent does the European Union collaborate? Collaborate, it's not the correct word maybe, but with NATO in the development of any sort of capabilities, given the fact that a number of its states, of member states of NATO, are also developing counter space capabilities, and this is linked, for instance, to what you mentioned before of Minister Parly, that 2 years ago mentioned the fact that France will proceed to an arsenalization for defensive purposes, of course, of its space infrastructure.
Yeah. So the growing trend towards some kind of weaponization of the outer space is something that any observer can observe. It is a pity. But of course, we can understand that that some countries are of the opinion that they cannot remain inactive and not take the relevant measures in order to build their capability to defend themselves. You have noted it. There are some movement on that, which has started approximately 2.5 years ago, and you quoted them. There is the USA decision to create a space force. You have the declaration by NATO that space is a war-fighting domain. You have the decision by several European Union member states, but also Japan, for instance, that they would also consider, and they have moved into building if not entirely a space force, but at least space capabilities in order to be able to defend their space assets. This is a fact. Now, as I very often say, the militarization of the space environment has existed from the very beginning. We should remember that the very first space capability was a remote sensing program from the US in order to monitor the nuclear development, nuclear industry development in Russia. So using space assets for situational awareness, for communication and other things, has always been part of the development of space capabilities, and this is profoundly a dual capability that has initially been used for defense purposes, very often before being used for civil purposes. It is well known that Galileo, for instance, is the very first global positioning system, so positioning, navigation, and timing system that has been developed with a civil purpose in mind. The other programs, be them the American GPS, the Russian GLONASS, the Chinese Beidou, to name only the global positioning systems, were all developed by the military initially and then offered, if I may say so, to civil use. So this move is, as always, existed, but it is correct that we see and we fear a growing not of militarization anymore, but of arsenalization, weaponization, in French, the arsenalisation of the space environment. And this is profoundly worrying and justifies movement at the multilateral level to try and counter that element, but also the reaction by some powers to include it in their arsenal, if I may say so, of weapons and of defense capabilities, the possibility to protect their space assets. The EU does not have, for the moment, a project of developing joint capabilities or whatever with NATO. As you know, and as you have said, quite a lot of EU member states are also NATO member states. The competency is at the level of the member states, not at the level of the European Union. We can consider starting to speak together in order to understand each other, in order to understand what we could do, one and the other. And when we will have understood those elements, then we could eventually see whether some kind of cooperation might be possible that would be promoted and, of course, acceptable for our respective member states, because they are the ones deciding on what we can do together. It is not a surprise in that framework that many PESCO projects, and I'm not speaking about space PESCO projects alone, but in general, that many PESCO projects that are initiated by our member states, EU member states, do indeed meet the requirements of capability developments that have been set up by NATO. Our member states, which are also NATO member states, do develop their capabilities according to the policy developed together with other NATO member states and according to the objectives that they are developing in the framework of the Alliance. And that they're using the tools that are at their disposal. And one of the tools is the PESCO projects that could lead to the use of the Europe Defence Fund funding to help them develop their capabilities. So I think there is no contradiction in that evolution. But there is, at least for the moment, we will see what the future will bring, but at least for the moment, there is no formal cooperation between the EU and NATO on those issues. I hope that I have answered to that question also, and that I have not forgotten one part of it.
And in a certain way, actually, we could see that there is a sort of replacement also through the narrative that has a bit changed both at the national and at the transatlantic level, that before space prominence was more meant in terms of civil program, and now there is a bit a step back through a military program, at least it was the case with the previous administration. I then have another question from a speaker, which is always related to the 3SOS and always at its practical implementation. And before you mentioned that, in fact, actually this initiative is really very open and receptive, so to say, of also inputs from interested states. And the question was whether member states can work together with the Space Task Force in planning and organizing events in the context of this initiative. So maybe this could be a practical information that you can provide.
Yes. So my answer is absolutely. This is possible. And the Space Task Force, I mean, my team is absolutely ready to collaborate with member states on possible initiatives. We, for instance, have in the pipe the organization of 1 or 2 workshops together with one of the think tanks of the Non-Proliferation Consortium during 2021. And I would be happy to collaborate with other European actors. In as far, I must say, it's more a question of availability of resources and mostly of human resources in my team. My team is very small, and so we are a bit in a difficult situation, but we will consider favorably as much as we can any offer of collaboration in this framework. So if one of the members of the audience or a speaker of another lecture has an idea of organizing something where the collaboration of the Space Task Force can help, they can contact me, and I will do whatever I can to provide assistance.
Okay. Perhaps we have room for another question. One of the speakers, the attendees, asks whether the strategic the new European space, not so new, 2016 European space strategy might have the capacity to, so to say, spread an idea of individuality of action on space exploration by the European Union. Maybe this is a broader question, and like, what will be now the action of the European Union in light of this, so to say, internal reform of its governance with regard to other entities involved in building our European space policy, and namely the European Space Agency. So whether the European Union will be more focused on an individual approach in building a European space policy, and what might be the next role for the European Space Agency. Even though we will have a lecture in this regard on this specific topic at some point.
Okay. Yeah, so I was not entirely clear on the question, particularly the first part of it. But according to what I heard, you were also focusing on the theme of the space exploration. And space exploration, like science, is much more in the hands of the European Space Agency than of the European Union as such. You will have noticed that space exploration is not one of the components of the soon to be adopted European Space Program regulation. Of course, space research and innovation in the framework, in the context of the space sector, can be approached by various European Union tools, like, for instance, also the Research and Innovation Program, Horizon Europe. But the exploration in itself is much more a task that has been, if I can say, delegated by the member states of the European Space Agency to what they are doing together in this agency. Which is mainly a scientific agency and a research agency. Something that of course the European Space Agency is doing very, very well. So the European Union is much more an observer of what our partners of the European Space Agency are doing in the space exploration domain, where we observe with great interest, and we, at least I am, really very, very proud of what the European continent, if I may say so, can produce in this framework. But without having for myself and for my institution any role in it. So it's more an external observer standpoint. Now the relationship between the European Space Agency and the European Union is a relationship of collaboration and cooperation, of course. As you know, the two groups of member states do not have neither the same member states nor the same kind of governance and institutional framework. The European Union is a union of member states. It has specific competences. It is a rule maker, essentially, and it has developed other competences, of which the development indeed of an EU space policy encompassing the development of what are now called components, before were called programs, of which two flagships are very well known, so the GNSS with Galileo and Copernicus, and then other smaller initiatives like the SST, Space Surveillance and Tracking Initiative, for instance, or GovSatcom. The ESA does not have the same member states. There are several member states of the European Union that are not a member of ESA. Most of them are states who do not have a significant space industry, and some member states of ESA are not the states of the European Union. Let me name Norway, Switzerland, and since the UK has left the European Union, the UK, which is still a member of ESA, as well as Canada, but Canada has an associated membership, which is not entirely member state status in ESA. So the two bodies are really different in nature, as well as in their way of functioning. However, they have developed together, and the European Union has made use of the development, the research, the scientific experience of ESA, with the two flagships having been developed together with ESA. With the new European Union Space Program regulation, there will be a new legal text which will regulate the relations between ESA and the European Union, in particular the European Commission and the agency for the European Union Space Program, which is called EU SPA in acronym, and which is the former GSA, which was responsible for operating the Galileo program the last years. This FFPA for Financial Framework Program is for the moment being negotiated, and the precise role of the various actors, trilateral agreements, so three actors, will be defined in this text that is being negotiated. The EEAS is not part of that, although it will be consulted at the end in the framework of what is called the inter-service consultation inside the European Commission. But as of course, for every negotiation, you will understand that I'm not saying anything about what happens during those negotiations, and that I will wait the result of the negotiation and the publication of the FFPA before being able to comment on it.
Perhaps one last question, and then if there isn't any more question, we can conclude our session. During the Germany's presidency of the Council of the European Union, the concept and the importance of space traffic management, also in support of a European space economy, was particularly emphasized. Also, at the European level, there was a sort of call for the European Union to intervene in building and agreeing on a concept of STM, and then to promote it with the other space powers in order to avoid what has been called by media and so on a US dominance in this regard. How, if it's involved, because in the end, also the 3SOS initiative affects the safety of operations, and this building, as you very nicely put it, is building preparing, so to say, the soil for future initiatives within the UN framework, as you mentioned. But on the other side, it is also building a bit an understanding which might potentially affect then the promotion and the agreement around a concept of STM. Is this the case, or the two initiatives are two completely different proposals, so to say? Or there's a common view in this regard? So all the different elements or the different institutions of the European Union are going in the same direction in this regard.
Okay. So first, if I may, a wish. Yes, indeed, I hope and I wish that we are going all in the same direction, and I think so. It's just not just a hope, a wish, but also I think a reality. However, the programs are different, the initiatives are different, but with common goals. And as I did indicate during the lecture, the SSA capability is an important part of what should be built on top of the on the foundation of the favorable soil. It is one of the legs of one of the pillars to build strategic autonomy for space. It is true that the various initiatives are coordinated. We are working together, and we do go in the same direction. The SSA component of the EU Space Program regulation is an important element, and my colleagues from the Commission, from DG DEFIS, are working very hard on developing this SSA component, of which an element of STM, of space traffic. And I said, I mean, the acronym is used is in general STM, but it covers either space traffic monitoring or space traffic management, or depending on the level of ambition, we can also speak about space traffic coordination in between. Because the real space traffic management is a level of ambition which is very high, and which I'm not entirely sure that even our American partners would be able to really operate a full space traffic management system. It is really a hard element. On this, my colleagues from the DG DEFI have launched several studies that will give the results during this year, and this will enable them to go a step further. They also are acting in the framework of ISO, the International Standardization Organization, in order indeed to control and to make sure that the standards are not unilaterally defined by one actor on the geopolitical scene. Whatever that actor is, when it happens that the proposal presently on the table of the ISO is an American proposal, but this is not the most important element. The most important element is that one country does not impose unilaterally to the others a particular standard, and this cannot be accepted. Yes, to answer your question, yes, indeed, we are going into the same direction. And yes, indeed, we have different competences, and therefore our action is a function of the competence that each actor has. And in these elements, next to the competences of European actors, so actors at the level of the European Union, we should certainly not forget the competence of the member states of the European Union, particularly in this framework. Maybe it's worth recalling that the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union gives to the European Union what is called a shared competence, a shared and parallel competence on the space matters, meaning that any competence that is being operated or being exercised by the European Union does not impede the member states to continue operating on their own, either on their own individually or on their own by putting capabilities and resources together in the framework of the European Space Agency.
As it was done, for instance, with the USSC consortium initially. Okay. And in terms of roadmaps for the 3SOS initiative, while you were mentioning before that the Commission through EU DEFI is working on a quite tight deadline for developing an STM concept and understanding, at least, this is not the case for the 3SOS initiative. I guess there it will, the work will be more, you have to build consensus, you have to have a transparent approach in the meanwhile, so the process might be longer in this regard. You don't have a roadmap.
It's true that our prospect is a much longer term prospect, but we have a roadmap with some milestones that we would like to respect. But quite a lot, of course, depends on the sanitary crisis, the evolution of the sanitary crisis, as well as of the resources, being them financial resources or staff resources that do permit it. There is no particular deadline for the 3 SOS initiative. It's something that has been initiated and that will continue, because we think that to maintain a fertile soil is a day-to-day activity and continuous activity. So there is no deadline to it. There's no expiry to it. And we will continue doing that, but that does not mean that we consider that we should not have a roadmap and progress. But it will continue to be a continuous activity indeed.
Okay, I think there are no further questions. I thank you very much on behalf also of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies for this lecture. And we actually thank you for the fact that it could be open this time and not only reserved for some students. It was a really interesting one. It is very clear that the European Union now has a real interest and objective to ensure a secure, safe and sustainable environment for outer space activities, and we really hope this will be the case, especially in light of the new developments of the increased space population. We thank you again. You can find the recorded lecture on our website, on the website of our Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. The name of the website is spacegovernance.eu. And please follow the next lecture series. It will be a very interesting lineup this year. We thank you again, Carine, for your really excellent lecture, and goodbye to everyone.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you to the audience and the interesting questions.
Okay.